Hello, I'm Nick Salmon, the Director of the Center for the Study of the United States. Welcome, everyone, to Woody Guthrie, The Left and the Politics of Intimacy, a discussion between David Suisman and the author, Gus Stadler. If everybody has managed to find a seat in our virtual room, I will begin with our land acknowledgement. We do this in lieu of complete reparations, which I hope someday will make this unnecessary. The sacred land on which we operate has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, and the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It is marked by a history of settler colonialism and genocide, as well as resistance. It is a site from which ongoing internal and external colonial projects are launched and extended, even as their persistence and violence is erased in dominant accounts of history, especially accounts of the present day. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Ojibwa and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. 2 Row Wampum says we are going to live on this land together and respect each other's sovereignty. The Dish with One Spoon is an agreement that recognizes that we live off of the same resources. It is hard to eat a collective meal together off a dish with one spoon. Hence, protocols are put in place to ensure mutual respect and accountability to each other and to the land. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. Our intersecting communities are comprised of those native to this land, Indigenous people from other territories, as well as settlers who have come here by choice, force, or otherwise a result of settler colonialism and imperialism. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission 94 Calls to Action reaffirms that the treaties with Indigenous peoples must be lawfully honored. We are all treaty peoples and are responsible for honoring and upholding these agreements. We are grateful for the opportunity to work on this territory and to share this space with all of you. Okay, I'd like to announce quite a few upcoming events at the Center for the Study of the United States. Very excited about all of these. Next week, January 20, from 4 p.m. to 5:30 p.m., it will be Blood, Populist Eugenics. Julie Carr from the University of Colorado Boulder will be in conversation with Cristina Rivera Garza about her work. On January 31st, from 3:30 to 5, will be our first graduate student workshop. The first one will be The Nuclear Underground, the United States, Canada, and the Rise of Nuclear Defense Infrastructure by Brianna Lohman, who is a grad student in history here at U of T. On February 3rd, from 12 to 1:30, is the Oxford Penn Toronto International Doctoral Cluster Lecture Series. The lecture by Justin Hosby from Emory University is Race, Justice, and the Ecological Legacy of the Plantation in Southern Louisiana. On February 7, our second graduate student workshop, Indigenous Journalism and Borderlands Activism, 1969 to 1975, with Hannah Roth Cooley, also of history at U of T. On February 14th, another graduate student workshop, Disseminating the Brotherhood, Communicating the Fenian Movement, 1858 to 1870, by Lewis Reed Wood at History of U of T. March 7, graduate student workshop, Vulture Capitalism, the Geography of Sovereign Debt Investment, Andrew Kaufman from Geography and Planning. On March 18, our Bissell-Hayde Colloquium, sponsored by our Bissell-Hayde Fellow, Lauren McLeod Kramer, at University of Toronto Cinema Studies Institute, will be Joint, a Black Gathering on Catastrophe. I urge you to turn out for what which promises to be a fantastic event. On March 24, we will also have Collectors, Selectors, Keepers, and MCs, Black Feminist Sonic World Making with Jennifer Lynn Stover from State University of New York at Binghamton, and The Keepers. This will also be a fantastic event. Please come out for it. And then finally, on April 4, our F. Ross Johnson Colloquium for the winter semester, Infrastructure and Empire, Conversation Across Borders. And we'll have information about all these events in greater detail on our website. Thank you. Just a reminder, you can ask questions throughout the event in the Q&A button at the lower right-hand side of your screen. The chat has been disabled, but you can post questions in the Q&A either during the talks or at the end when we will leave time for questions and answers. Please store up your questions and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Thank you. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Um, David Suisman is an associate professor of history at the University of Delaware, where he specializes in cultural history, the history of music, sound studies, war and society, and the history of capitalism. His books include Selling Sounds, The Commercial Revolution in American Music from Harvard University Press, 2009, which received numerous awards and honors, rightly so, and Sound in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, University of Pennsylvania Press, 2010, co-edited with Susan Strasser. His articles and reviews have appeared in the Journal of American History, Radical History Review, Social Text, The Believer, American Historical Review, Journal of Social History, and other publications. From 2010 to 2021, he was associate editor and book review editor of the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and he is a sometimes disc jockey at freeform radio station WFMU, and he lives in Philadelphia. Gustavus Stadler is William R. Kennan Professor and Chair of English at Haverford College in Haverford, Pennsylvania, where he directs the John B. Herford Center for the Arts and Humanities. In addition to Woody Guthrie and Intimate Life, which we will hear from today, which is Beacon Press 2020, he's the author of Troubling Minds, The Cultural Politics of Genius in the United States, 1840 to 1890, from University of Minnesota Press, 2006. He has published essays on US literature, music, and politics in such venues as Al Jazeera, Public Books, Avidly.com, and Social Text. Professor Stadler's Woody Guthrie, An Intimate Life, is a new biography from the storied folk singer and icon of the popular front left. And this book disentangles him from the myths and sets him down amid a messy, contradictory human struggles of his day. The Los Angeles Review of Books recently described this book as, quote, an expansive and strikingly unique portrait of a man, not an immortal legend. The book is also a sort of intimate history of the left, tracking the vital importance of Guthrie through a series of dilemmas about illness and shame, pain and joy as they are experienced through the body, intimacy as a crucible for solidarity, all of which suggest a greater continuity between old and new lefts than we are used to acknowledging. And now it is my pleasure to turn things over to Professor Stadler, who will read from the book I just described. And I'm very much looking forward to this event and this conversation. Thank you very much. David and Gus, please take it away.
Thank you, Nick. I'm so happy to be here. And thanks also to Daria and Mio and Adam for their help getting this together today. I'm going to actually read from the very beginning of the book, first few pages of the book, and which tells a story that embodies a lot of the concerns of the book. The title of the chapter is When to Be Personal. One evening in March 1942, Woody Guthrie strolled into a small New York dance studio and sat down on a folding chair. As he pulled the strings of his guitar into tune, he watched a small group of dancers, 8 women and 2 men, stretching and twisting themselves effortlessly, bringing home the contrast with his own broken down physical state, the stiffness in his joints, the smoke-tarred inside of his lungs. The group chatted casually with an ease that belied the bandages and gauze pads covering their knees and ankles. He knew 2 of the group before him. One was the ensemble's leader, Sophie Maslow, who was surveying the room and getting ready to start the rehearsal. Sophie was the one who had invited him here just a few days ago. It wasn't the type of thing he'd ever done. The decision to participate was a fairly easy one. She'd already choreographed a couple of solo pieces based on his Dust Bowl ballads recording from 1940. Her previous works as a choreographer were tributes to the Soviet Union, a nation whose social and political structure both she and he were given to describing in idealistic utopian terms. And her idea for this piece sounded good to him: dances based on folk forms to traditional American songs, along with excerpts from the poetry of Carl Sandburg. She wanted Guthrie's guitar to accompany the group she assembled, made up of dancers moonlighting from established companies. Sophie herself, for instance, danced in the illustrious, artistically groundbreaking Martha Graham Dance Company. In between dance numbers, the plan was for Guthrie and another musician to act out comic dialogues and sketches, highlighting the folksy wit and wisdom with which he'd built a following on both radio and records, first in Los Angeles in the late 1930s, and now in New York and beyond. Sophie called everyone to order and nodded at him. The first number in the piece, titled Folks Say, was the traditional I Write in Old Paint, staple of his repertoire, of everyone's repertoire. He started to strum the simple chord progression, The dancers, dressed in denim, plaid shirts, and cowboy hats, began to move, directed by some graceful, invisible muse. Then something in the atmosphere changed. One young woman hesitated and quickly recovered, but a couple of seconds later, another girl got stuck waiting for Guthrie to deliver a beat that arrived just a split second late. She tripped, cursed, giggled a little along with the others. Maslow, worried about time and suppressing annoyance at the guitarist's sloppiness, called him back into order. He began to run through the chords again, wondering if the cocky grin he'd summoned had succeeded in hiding that he was nervous and scared. Things started out better. It was such a simple song. He played it hundreds of times at parties in North Texas, in clearings among tents of exhausted workers in California migrant camps, hootenannies full of beer-soaked communist intellectuals in Los Angeles. Now here in New York City, but suddenly a clatter of colliding limbs and someone was splayed on the floor. This time there was no laughter, just looks of concern, and he's afraid some scowls in his direction. They're probably wondering how it could be so hard to play such a simple song at an even tempo. They might even be thinking he was a fraud. Why not just dance to records? It was going to be this much trouble if people were going to get hurt. All the camaraderie and ease of minutes ago had dissolved, it seemed. Sophie might even have been considering other guitar players. When he'd arrived at the rehearsal, he'd recognized one person in the room other than Maslow, and now she was approaching him. People here called her Margie. She'd introduced herself as Marjorie Mazia, whom she and Maslow had shown up unannounced a few nights earlier at the house he was sharing with a group of politically like-minded musicians called the Almanac Singers. Like Maslow, Mazia had been taken aback by Guthrie's Dust Bowl ballads. In these 1940 recordings, both young women heard echoes of the Yiddish songs their parents sometimes sang to them as children, laments for people that, just like the Dust Bowl victims, were made homeless by greed and exploitation. It made them feel a connection with a population they'd barely known existed. Walking over to the singer, Margie held something in her hand, a stack of what looked like those cardboard cards that come in new shirt packages. Smiling, radiant, looking sharp-eyed but reassuring, she sat down on the floor in front of him and began to write numbers and cues on the cards. "Now, Woody," she said, "if you can count, you can do this." That night in the dance studio, as Guthrie tried to do his part to assist Maslow's company in their endeavor, he required help achieving a more literal, microcosmic version of what his songs and writing encouraged others to do. Get organized, become part of a planned movement, join in a united collaborative process. And yet this personal intervention in a scene of poor timing, disorder, bodies made vulnerable, helped set Woody Guthrie's life on a new course. It's a story that both Woody and Marjorie retold many times over the course of their lives, one that their daughter, Nora Guthrie, calls a part of their family lore. Fundamentally, it reflects the clash of two ways of keeping time, the loose and improvisational rhythms of folk music at odds with the intricate, precise timing of modern choreography, an unlikely alchemy with which not only Maslow, but Martha Graham and other eminent modernists were experimenting. But as a family legend, it describes an inaugural act of intimacy, an unsolicited but much needed offer of care in a moment of helplessness. Woody Guthrie's fascination with the revolutionary potential of intimacy, honed during a lifetime of contact with fragile bodies, including just a few years after his dance rehearsal, his own, is the subject of this book. It shouldn't come as a surprise that dance would be an arena of significant anxiety for Woody Guthrie. The slight man sitting on a folding chair with a guitar, struggling to hide his shame, knew very well that human bodies are precarious things, and that consequently, they make us need the intimate care and attention of other people. That awareness filled his original songs, like the ones Maslow and Mazia had heard on his record, in which he described the human wreckage caused by dust storms, floods, and other so-called natural catastrophes, whose impact increased proportionally with the poverty of the people affected. It was in his persistent attention to the predations of capitalism and the damage routinely done to workers laboring in substandard, even dangerous conditions. He knew the violent blowback they could expect from their bosses when they banded together as a group to seek a fair share of their labor's rewards or a healthier working environment. He had sung about this in songs like Dust Pneumonia Blues, Dust Can't Kill Me, Hard Traveling, and many more. I'm going to skip a few paragraphs here, but I talk a little bit about the environment in which he grew up, which was in Eastern Oklahoma, in close to the relatively close to Tulsa, where the race massacre took place in 1921. Also, a year before he was born, there was a lynching just out of a Black woman and her son just outside of his hometown, and there's a good deal of evidence that points to the possibility that Guthrie's own father was involved in the lynching, but the lynching resulted in one of the more notorious images of lynching photography. It was a postcard that was distributed all over the country of, some of you may have seen it, of a woman and a young boy hanging from a bridge. And I'm also gonna skip a little bit over a sort of parallel set of physical catastrophes that infected his family during his childhood, that had to do with fire, and a couple of very shocking happenings in which fire potentially set by his mother was responsible for the death of first his sister, and then the near death a couple of years later of his father. And these events eventually ended up basically breaking up the family. His mother was committed to what would have been called an insane asylum at the time as a result of them. And we can talk more about how I'm understanding some of sort of this, these traumas to have impacted his work, and what I'm trying to bring out in his work. So 15 years later, after the fire with his father, and half a continent away, the problems in the studio, the dance studio, young agile dancers endangering their limbs and joints while struggling to keep up with Guthrie's muddled timekeeping, would seem to resemble slapstick comedy more than any of these disturbing violent episodes. But Guthrie's long-lasting fixation on the rehearsal incident, his attention to what he would later call dancers bumping and tromping on one another, illustrates his lifelong preoccupation with the fragility of bodies, with their propensity for coming unorganized and undone, with their need for assistance, care, and repair. That a trait of his own bodily comportment, his uneven sense of rhythm, triggered the dancer's mishaps, resonated with his long-held suspicion that he was somehow at odds with, out of sync with, the world. It reprised something of his childhood belief that he had caused his mother's mysterious illness, a self-punishing fantasy he described in the autobiographical novel whose manuscript pages he was scribbling when he got home from folksay rehearsals and performances. In fact, his mother, Nora Bell, suffered from Huntington's disease, known before the 1970s as Huntington's chorea, the Greek word for dance, poignantly. Huntington's is a hereditary neurological illness with brutal physiological and cognitive effects. But because so little was known about the illness, and because so few doctors had seen cases, she was treated as, quote unquote, insane and sent to an early death in a state asylum. Sometime nearly two decades later, in the mid to late 1940s, after he'd written and recorded many songs documenting the vulnerability of bodies to social, political, and economic forces, Guthrie himself began to experience symptoms of Huntington's, thus experiencing a new kind of intimacy with his mother's body. The nervous, blustery man sitting on a folding chair in the downtown Manhattan dance studio, awkwardly participating in a performance conceived by a woman and performed by a majority female troupe, is not the Woody Guthrie we know. The familiar images of a rough and ready folk singer who scrawled militant slogans on his guitar, a champion of the common man, a master composer of a protest song, a boxcar hopping ramblin' man in the romantic tradition of peripatetic figures like Twain's Huckleberry Finn, Cooper's Natty Bumppo, Melville's Voyagers on the Pequod, perhaps even a blueprint for the imminent emergence of Jack Kerouac and Neil Cassidy in their roles as countercultural heroes. We know him as a fierce supporter of the labor movement, passionate cheerleader for the public works projects of the New Deal, and perhaps some kind of communist. He's well established as Bob Dylan's idol and mentor. An anodyne version of his song, "This Land Is Your Land," stripped of the verse indicting the concept of private property, circulates through elementary schools and various misbegotten political campaigns, making it easy for us to know him as a classic American mythical figure, the male wanderer, unfettered by social conventions associated with home, work, and family. It is a fantasy of rebellion so widely evoked for so long as to be paradoxically, quintessentially conventional. The magnetism of this Woody Guthrie has obscured another side of him, the side that is the focus of this book. Quote, "The lesson to learn, the only lesson to learn, is just when to be and when not to be very personal," he scrawled during one of his frantic writing sessions in the mid-1940s as he was trying to continue expanding his artistic profile while witnessing the labor-centered left, amid which he'd earned his reputation, struggle to resist the cold wave of post-war anti-communist hysteria. He was someone interested in thinking about how it feels to be in the world, with what makes us feel good, being close to others, sharing secrets with them, having sex with them, and what makes us feel bad, injustice, inequality, but also shame, insult, isolation from loved ones. This Guthrie was an artist in multiple modes: music, verse and prose, fiction, painting. He didn't see the personal against the political. The personal wasn't synonymous with the private, in the sense of that term suggesting a retreat from the public world of politics and power struggle. The political stakes of knowing when to be very personal reflected his deep concern with what our bodies tell us about life, with how they make us vulnerable to and dependent on others, with how they make the historical context in which we live not just an object of knowledge, but something we feel. He conveyed his perspective in how he conveyed this perspective in how he described his contact with the Communist Party of Oklahoma. Quote, "They gave me as good a feeling as I ever got from being around anybody in my life." He read Marx, but he was not a theorist or policymaker, at least not in the traditional sense. A just reorganization of the world, he believed, would occur not at the behest of some intellectual's insight, but because the people who made up the mass have been empowered to resist the feelings of demoralization and cynicism forced on them. Capitalism and fascism both secured hegemony by maintaining particular emotional environments, encouraging cruelty and shame, and persuading people that they were, quote, born to lose. As with healing damaged bodies, overcoming this abject emotional atmosphere required interpersonal collaboration, acts of repair. Feeling shame was a kind of social wound that could be treated by love and reassurance. His role as an artist was essentially the role of a partner or other intimate to solve these feelings and rejuvenate participation in the fight for justice. I'm going to stop there.
I don't know. Can you see me yet?
I can see you. I don't know if other people can see you.
Okay, I'll go on. Well, Nick, Gus, thank you. That was great. I mean, I think this is a brilliant and beautifully written book, and it's insightful. It's erudite, and it's often moving and poetic. It's a book that deserves many readers, and I hope we'll find many readers over a long, long time. So it's really an honor and a pleasure to have the chance to talk to you about the book. I also have a personal connection to the subject. When I was, I grew up listening to, well, a lot of Bob Dylan records. My first introduction to the Guthrie family was through Arlo Guthrie, as was true for probably a fair number of people my age, particularly Alice's Restaurant. And then through Arlo, I discovered Woody, and his work made a deep impression on me. And my first academic publication actually was a review of an exhibition of Woody's paintings at the Smithsonian in the 1990s. And then most recently, I had the pleasure of meeting Arlo Guthrie's septic tank cleaner. So I've got a connection here too.
You're closer as far as I can tell. But yeah.
So this is great, and I love the book. But as far as the conversation goes, I wanted to start by asking you to situate the project a little bit. I happen to know that you are a person of very broad musical and historical interests, and that you've written on subjects ranging from the late 19th century to the 21st century, from sound recordings of lynchings or allegedly sound recordings made of lynchings to Joni Mitchell, Andy Warhol, all kinds of stuff. And so I was wondering if maybe you could start by just talking about why Woody Guthrie and why now?
Yeah, it's funny. I think I do have a kind of tendency to jump from place to place, and I get excited about things, and a wide range of things. And it's interesting, I think, actually, the origin of this project really came from something I was thinking about. I just wanted to learn more about sort of the early mobilizations around gay rights and like rights to do with sexuality. And I discovered somewhere that there was this treatment center that was founded by Quakers, and I teach at a Quaker school. That made it even more interesting, that Woody Guthrie had been sent to as a result of an arrest for sending obscene materials through the mail. And this was like late 1940s. So it's very early in like the history of like activism around anything to do with there almost wasn't yet any sizable activism organized around sexuality. So I was interested in learning more about this place, and I went to the Guthrie archive sort of as a step along the way in that project. And then once I got into the archive, I just became completely engrossed. I think I would even say seduced. I mean, it's a sort of unbelievable set of materials that I really hadn't been prepared for encountering. It's he was a compulsive writer of lyrics, of poems, of journals, of essays. He was a brilliant visual artist. His letters and manuscripts have these gorgeous images that he would paint over them in watercolor. There's this kind of, I think of William Blake sometimes. It's like a strangely analogous figure. And the content of the writing also just spans all of these areas that you don't associate with him, like sex and love and child rearing. And that's all mixed up with the politics. There was a lot there that was just aesthetically really engaging and attractive. And there was a lot there that was interesting because of how different it was from, what I knew, which was the pretty much this conventional image of Guthrie and the Okie minstrel and, the labor song singer. And it was just a much more complicated and multifaceted person that I was seeing there that hadn't been described in anything I'd seen or heard, and it seemed like this whole realm of creativity had been marginalized in his work for some reason, and so I was intrigued by that and trying to figure out why that was, but it's true that sort of at this sort of basic level, I just got hooked. I went in thinking like, okay, maybe I can write an article about something, sort of having to do with Woody Guthrie in this center. But like by my second day in the archive, I was like, this is a book.
So yeah. that really grounds the book in your personal interests. What about justifying when you went to sell the book? How did you explain why the world needed another book about Woody Guthrie?
Yeah. I think, what became clear to me over the course of doing the book, but pretty early on, is that he is sort of counterintuitively, he is one of those figures where there's a different version of this person for different times. Like there's enough there. The level of complexity around him means that, yes, he can be that kind of like hero of the common man needed by the 30s left, a very masculine 30s left. You can do that too. But then when you get the full picture of him, which requires seeing the archive because most of these materials aren't published, you see someone who can speak very cogently to issues like sexuality and the regulation of sexuality, to race and to whiteness and to racial violence, and I think also just to the sort of the relationship of all of these different modes of politics, and because I think the sort of common thread, the common currency here is feeling. I mean, it is, he saw each of these, what we would call issues, I think, through the lens of like, what feelings do these issues create in people? What feelings need to be overcome? What feelings help overcome them? And that's why, he becomes really kind of fixated on shame and stigma later in his career, for instance, because he starts to feel like that's an extremely disempowering, debilitating sort of affect that's deployed politically in all kinds of ways. Yeah.
I mean, that's such a huge part of the book. Can you say more about that? About the emergence of shame in his worldview, why it doesn't emerge earlier, and what its consequences are as it does emerge for him? Shame and stigma. I mean, these are enormously resonant concepts in the book.
Yeah. This was really fascinating to me, and I think there's a few dimensions to this question, to the answer to this question. One thing that I think he does as a musician. So there's already, I think, a tradition in American folk music of sort of, talking about being down and out, talking about being, going down the road feeling bad, which is a song he actually did. There were also, of course, labor songs that predate his by decades from the IWW, and those tend to be kind of rousing songs, sort of instrumental, like functional, just like to kind of rally a picket line. And there's something about his music, and I don't want to say it's totally exceptional, but like, I feel like he sort of blends the emotional depth of music that he was hearing, I mean, from places like the Carter family, from some of those like traditional Americana artists, but also from the blues too. I think is a key element in his having this kind of emotional palette. And I guess having that labor tradition in the background, and this sort of sense that that sort of, again, affective toolbox that he's bringing to his songwriting is still, under it all, motivated by bringing justice to people who are the victims of capitalism, essentially. Yeah, I mean, I think you just see a kind of, especially, having the advantage of having read a lot of his other writing that isn't in the lyrics, but you just see this rich emotional kind of, or much richer emotional vocabulary emerge, and emerge in a way that it's still supposed to contribute politically, it's still supposed to like contribute to the recuperation and again, repair of people suffering through these, capitalist caused catastrophes. But they have a kind of, I think there's more story in them in a way. There's something, they seem to work by identification in a way more easily. I think I'm not sure if I'm getting away from your initial question, but if you want to bring me back somewhere.
No. Well, actually, I want to keep talking about music and feeling, and sort of think about how, when we're talking about shame and all these resonant concepts in the book, but as you're talking about feeling being so deeply embedded in his musical work and his other work, I was wondering, as somebody who, I'm assuming that as you went through the archives and you looked at all of his many media, you also looked at a lot of song lyrics and presumably unpublished song lyrics.
Yeah.
Is there like a range or a kind of song that you saw there that doesn't get recorded? Is there another Woody Guthrie, or is there like this more expressive songwriter, a different kind of songwriter that emerges if you look at all these other unpublished songs?
Yeah, so the topical Guthrie is consistent, never ends, never lets up, all the way to until he has Huntington's to the extent that he can't work anymore. He's still like writing songs about the North Korean, the Korean War, and or things that are, cases of police violence in New York in 1953 or things like that. But yes, you do see more songs that are more internalized, more love songs. I think I actually think that people who are familiar with the Mermaid Avenue collections that Nora Guthrie organized in collaboration with Billy Bragg and Wilco, some of that side of his songwriting gets well represented on those records. There's more material there that's just sort of about relationships that aren't either like expressly political or just a performance of a really old song, a very old traditional song, like which is another thing he recorded quite a few of. So it seems as though he was interested in using songwriting, becoming more interested in using songwriting to talk about feelings, to talk about interiority, and some of the songs are more abstract too. Some of them have really strange lyrics. There's some overlap, I think, between that and the fact that he was writing all of these songs with his 3-year-old daughter, 3 and 4-year-old daughter, which he eventually put out two sets of children's songs, and a lot of the songs are really silly and they're wonderful, but I think the looseness of those songs, I think, is on a continuum with some of what was happening in other songs that he was writing at the time.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Mermaid Avenue CDs, because they really were revelatory for me as somebody who knew something of his older work, that they placed him so much more in the present also, and I mean that both in kind of like the historical present. I mean, he sings about baseball and Ingrid Bergman, or he writes about them, and he the kind of emotional present, the psychological present too, in a way that was really eye-opening and ear-opening for me. Right. But we could keep talking about music the whole time, but I actually want to kind of shift a little bit, because it's maybe a little misleading to suggest that the book has music at the center of it. He's best known as a musician, obviously. Yeah, but one of the things that's so revelatory and so fascinating about the book is the extent to which you're able to decenter music and to explore his expressive palette through all these different media. I mean, through painting and dance in certain ways, and his like, I mean, he writes plays, he writes novels, he writes, poetry. It's so vast. And so, yes, it was revelatory about the book. And I'd love to hear you, sort of talk about your thinking in how you placed music or didn't place music in the book.
Yeah. Before I forget, I want to put in a plug actually here. There's a new book out that Nora Guthrie just put out called Woody Guthrie Songs and Art, Words and Wisdom. It's a beautiful, large volume of material that has, more material from the archive, more of the kind of stuff that I was looking at that has ever been put out before, published before. And it's done in a lovely way where you see, it's an art book, and you see things in their actual original format. That just prompted me, that's made me think that I should give a little shout out there. But yeah, it's, that is one of the most striking things as soon as you get into the archive, is just how many notebooks there are and how many different kinds of writing are going on, playwriting, screenplays, diary writing, you're never quite sure if it's a poem or a song. Although he did sort of keep his songwriting, tend to keep his lyrics in separate books. And yeah, I think it was very important to me to kind of displace music to some extent, just because I felt like this other material needed to have justice done for it. I think they shouldn't be kept separate from the music, but I think you just do get a lot of, exactly this sort of sense of his interest in just like emotional texture and the just the ways that emotions felt between people are such a driving or potentially limiting force. Sort of you get a kind of, I guess, more explicit sense of that in some places in the prose, in some of the prose, for example. In a way, it sort of becomes like the theory for what's being enacted in the songs, in a sense, but that's not always the case. I think some of the songs also really bring out directly the degree to which, I think the body and feelings around the body were really, really a major focus and a major priority for his work.
It's interesting to get a sense from the book of the scope and the range of the archive that you were dealing with. And I was thinking it's kind of ironic that there's a quote on the cover of your book from a well-known critic, and he says something to the extent that Woody left few traces. And the book is really exciting because this is from a period where Woody left few traces. And as I read the book, I was like, no, he doesn't. He left tons of traces, actually. He left, there's so much that you are working with. You're not inventing this other Woody Guthrie. It's really rich, the material that you're dealing with.
He left a lot of traces. It's really true. He was a big tracer. He was always tracing. But no, I that is an interesting quote as I think about it, because it's not so much that he didn't leave traces. It's just, I think previous biographers haven't been looking for those traces because they don't fit into the story that, they've wanted to tell. I think, for instance, say I think there are two basically major biographies, one by Joe Klein and one by Ed Cray. There's also a wonderful book about Guthrie's politics written by Will Kaufman, which I highly recommend. But those more kind of biographies tend to shunt the years after he moves to New York, which is basically when I start my book. And, a lot of the reasons for that include what he's doing before that is more assimilable into that kind of classic American tale of the man on the road, and the kind of political work he's doing, like singing to migrants, and has more of a kind of grounding in the Grapes of Wrath, and there's already a kind of set there built for it. And then when he gets to New York, he's living in Greenwich Village around all these modernists and like people from the avant-garde, and he's interested in that stuff. Largely through Marjorie, who's a Martha Graham dancer, who's teaching Merce Cunningham, who's just joined the Martha Graham company. He's like going to parties at Merce Cunningham and John Cage's loft, and that kind of stuff doesn't fit the image that we have. Then he starts to try to do different things in his work, like, I think what we were talking about before, songs that aren't as explicitly political, songs that like children's songs or genre songs. He writes this really, really interesting but strange suite of songs about Sacco and Vanzetti, which I write a chapter about, which in a way is like they're the classic leftist heroes of, martyrs of left history in the US. And, his record producer like suggests that he writes this album about these men who were like, wrongly convicted and had an atrociously unfair trial. And he does it, or tries to do it. But he has a lot of trouble doing it. And what he sort of ends up with is this really bleak album about sort of about the mood of the left this is 1947. I mean, he tells the stories of Sacco and Vanzetti and the trial, et cetera. But protest music written about, or to preserve like something in the leftist tradition is supposed to be inspiring and rousing. And there's really not much of that in this very strange record, to the extent that the last song on the record is, it's called We Welcome to Heaven. And it's a lament, this series of laments about how when you're on Earth, when you're alive, all you do is get shamed by people. You get teased for being different in one way or another. Either you're too fat, or like you're too skinny, or you drink too much, or you don't drink enough, or like you have too much sex, or you don't have enough sex, like all of these things. And it's like it's a really strange, it sort of comes out of nowhere. Like its relationship to Sacco and Vanzetti is eclectic, but and it seems to sort of embody this like, and so he's he's sort of saying like, so Sacco and Vanzetti, you're lucky to be dead, you're lucky to be out of this, and I think that's an instance in which the kind of mood, and a mood that's has something to do with the growth of the Red Scare, now this is 1947, takes over his ability to write like a rousing song, I mean, I think there are other reasons that that record was a difficult one for him. But I think he was trying to write in a way that had, again, like, more of an emotional palette, and as a result, a lot of people say it's a terrible album. I mean, a lot of his critics and scholars say that it's a failure as an album. In fact, it didn't come out for like 15 years until after it was recorded. It was sort of reshuffled, and they threw a Pete Seeger song onto it, and so yeah. And that's the thing. I think he became harder and harder to read. I mean, then and in some ways now too, as the 40s went on and as the 50s started, just because of the work he was doing, the kind of work he was doing, it was harder to assimilate him into the kind of standing ideas of what a folk protest singer was.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting to think here about how the problem of the Sakon Vanzetti record, for example, reflects his complicated relationship with the left, and the way that he complicates these shibboleths of a kind of leftist politics by introducing these other issues and other kind of challenges to sort of what belongs on a political record or in the frame of politics. And I think in a lot of ways the book is about exploring Woody's political imagination, the breadth of his political imagination and the richness of his political imagination. And it's so powerful the way the book does this, without getting sort of locked into this being a conventional biography. Like this is a book, and I know that in earlier stages of the project, thinking about the left was more explicit, or your discussions of the left were more explicit. And this is so much a book that really does elevate questions about what the left was, what the old left was, what the old left wasn't, what the old left could have been in some ways. And in suggesting that Woody, with this political imagination, really expands how we imagine the left of that period, I think. Is that in line with your understanding of this?
Yeah. Well, while I was writing the book, I mean, fairly long into the process, I really wasn't quite sure what kind of book it was, and on a number of levels. Like, first of all, was it going to be a scholarly book, or was it going to be a trade book, like a pop, for a broader audience? And then second of all, was it a biography or was it something else? Because there's not much material about the boxcar years, or the years that you see in the 70s movie about Woody Guthrie, Bound for Glory. So I'm cutting out big chunks of his life. So that seems like an autobiography can't quite work. And I'm also concerned with, a certain set of topics, and a biography is usually guided more purely by chronology and what happens the next year and what happens the next year. Now, I really actually like biography. Unlike a lot of my academic friends, I actually really enjoy reading biographies. I think that, I like minutia. I like, gossip. I like learning little details, like, oh, Woody was at a party at Merce Cunningham and John Cage's loft, or, Marjorie Mazzeo was Merce Cunningham's mentor, or whatever. And I learned a bunch of things like that. For instance, that Woody knew Harry Hay, who would become the head of the first national gay rights organization, through communist circles in Los Angeles. Things like that are I'm always like really, really turned on by like, those unexpected connections. But I think you do have to ask at a certain level, like, what are there things that the genre of biography sort of makes unspeakable because of the sort of compulsion to like tell a unified story, one that progresses in a, one that progresses, develops, that, has its points of, it's sort of whatever the restrictions of narrative. And my concern with particular issues like the body and like intimacy and sexuality, et cetera, in a way was at odds with that emphasis on narrative. So, I kind of tried to come out in the middle and organize the chapters so they were each around a topic, but that the topic was something that he was concerned in at a particular point in his life. And I think there actually is like a narrative of the concerns, the topics, the issues with which he was most concerned that does follow kind of a pretty chronological order. In the 40s that has more to do with sexuality and the body, and in the 50s it has more to do with race, actually.
The racial politics really emerge, and I think it's the penultimate chapter. It's very moving and it deals a lot with his expression through his paintings. It's one of the most memorable chapters of the book.
Yeah, that's some really difficult material that is related to, as I said in the opening reading, this family history of, or at least, local history of his childhood, this horrible lynching that occurred the year before he was born, and the possibility of his father's having been involved in it. And it's something that, he wrote a few songs about lynching, a couple of songs about lynching, one of which makes references to this particular lynching, but he sort of frames it so that he's, his father, I think in the song, is like the jailer of the jail that the lynch mob breaks the mother and child out of so that they can murder them. So he and there's a couple other, like there's a drawing that he made that shows a bunch of people hanging from a bridge. You get this sense that he was sort of, whether, semi-consciously or consciously or what, struggling to kind of confront that part of his past. And his family's direct involvement in this act of racial violence. But what I noticed, so at one point, I was really taken aback to see this long notebook, as well as some other pieces of paper that were filled with these paintings of people being lynched. And they're very strange paintings. I'm sorry that I don't have any images to show to you. I need to get permission to show an image even in a talk like this, and I wasn't able to do that in time. But there's some in the book. There's some are actually in my book. But he paints these pictures of people being lynched, people being attacked by what look like Klan members. They're somewhat ambiguous racially. In some of the images, people are being lynched while having sex or engaged in sexual activities. And it just struck me that, and these are paintings that are being made in like 1953, 54, which is, he's feeling significant symptoms of Huntington's at this point, and those symptoms, affect both the mind and the body. But one of the things that I try to argue in the book, and I try to at least sort of make possible as a way we might think in the book, is that somebody who's disabled, like a condition like Huntington's, may actually, not to romanticize or glorify, but may actually like attain types of insight that others can't. So that they may, have the kind of attunement to the body that like, for instance, I think in the case of these paintings, has Guthrie making some kind of connection between the lynching of Black bodies and, as problematic as it is, it's sort of like what his own body has gone through, having been arrested on obscenity charges, having been sent to mental hospitals already. I have this sense of something in that experience, which other biographers treat as utterly only debilitating, like, in this very ableist fashion, actually opening up ideas and modes of representation for him. I think just, again, that's another reason that this material hasn't really been a significant part of any of the previous biographies, is because there is this sort of standard narrative that says, like, oh, well, then when he starts to do all that weird stuff, that's because he's getting sick, and and then we don't need to pay attention to his work. When he starts to like write about sex all the time, or when he starts to write these abstract things, or even this Sanko and Benzetti, that was a bad album, but he was getting sick, so it becomes this crutch to explain why he was not the same artist that he'd always been. And I really wanted to counter that. I really wanted to undo that, the sort of dominance of that assumption.
Yeah,
there is a lot of work. I mean, there is a fair bit of work that he's still doing when he was definitely experiencing the Huntington's symptoms.
Yeah. I've got about 50 more questions I'd like to ask, but I don't think I should, because I think we probably have some questions from the crowd. Nick, are you going to moderate?
Yeah, I am going to moderate. We don't yet have questions, so I'm going to encourage the remaining participants to put your questions into the Q&A, and I will relay them to Gus and to David. And while you guys are thinking about that, I will ask, if I may, a brief question, Gus. I want to talk a little bit about the title for the talk, the politics of intimacy, and the fact that you titled the book An Intimate Life, rather than An Intimate Portrait, which is a much more like biographical kind of title. Mm-hmm. And I'm really curious about, because you began, when you were prefacing your reading, with a discussion of that you were like actually trying to research early queer organizing and the sense of the importance of intimacy in that. And so I'm wondering if you have a brief sort of idea of, I'm sure they're quite large ideas, but a brief way of framing why the politics of intimacy are important to you and why they're important for us understanding Woody Guthrie. I mean, it kind of, you discussed it all the way through so far, but I just want to like nail down the term intimacy and its importance, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, David kind of alluded to this earlier, but for a long time, I really wanted to call the book Woody Guthrie and the Intimate Life of the Left. My editor did not like that title, but that reflected, I think, something that I'm not able to do in the book, or not able to do yet, which is to kind of really get a broader sense of how many people in the left of the Popular Front, sort of 30s, early 40s years, were thinking in this way? You know, were there other people thinking in as elaborate and hopeful, way about the power of emotion and the power of relationships between people? I mean, I think there were more people thinking about psychoanalysis in a way, but that's a sort of different thing. That clinical approach to interior life is really different from, I think, what Guthrie was interested in. So I had been sort of thinking about it. This is one figure in the middle of a milieu, and we'll use it to talk more about that milieu. And I wanted. There's a little bit of that in here, and I want to do more with that eventually, I think. The book, this kind of comes back to my struggle to decide whether to make this an academic book or a trade book. And, and I went back and forth a lot about that. Because I think, for an academic book, I would have had to do something a little more geared towards situating Guthrie in that period, and situating his approach in that period, and who else was thinking along similar lines, and where was this coming from, et cetera, et cetera. I think that as I got more and more into the project, for one thing, that started to seem really hard. And there was all this material there, and that I just really also wanted to, from the archive, that I really wanted to bring in. But, and this is coming back to the issue of biography and what biography can and can't do. I found myself really wanting, in a way that in a manner that I think sort of was mimicking what I felt Woody to be doing in his work, wanting to do something that sort of conveyed, that was less argument driven, and conveyed the feeling of, what it was like to live that life, and to sort of, and I'm not sure I succeeded in doing this. I don't think I did, actually, but the idea was there the whole time, sort of writing a book, writing a story of somebody's life, but you're not like a biographer who's outside, the master outside, who can assess everything for what it means now that you have this distance, but rather to be more concerned with conveying the texture of the opacity of the various moments in which he lived, and the difficult questions that he faced as a result of the cultural and political context in which he lived. And I mean, I think, to the extent that I succeed in doing something like that, it's a little bit different from conventional biography, which, has this tendency to emphasize a single agent who knows what he's doing, who knows what he or she or they are doing, who makes decisions easily that have, major ramifications, et cetera, et cetera. And I was trying to kind of again, sort of convey that sense of sort of not knowing when, what it feels like when you're in a certain moment of history and you just don't know what's happening, as we are all very familiar with right now, perhaps more than ever. So yeah, I don't know if is that.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason I asked the question is because we are many of us engaged in this moment right now in which intimacy is very performative in social media. There's a kind of, a performance of intimacy, which is not necessarily what I think you mean. I do have two questions from Kelsey Kilgore, which I'd like to read. And you can read them in the Q&A if you want, but I'll just read them out right now. Kelsey asks, first, read chronology. Having Huntington's in my family, from Oklahoma no less, I'm curious about the points on the timeline of his physical state. When did he lose his ability to play the guitar, his ability to modulate his voice, to control a pen? With what productions, activities, or life events did those markers intersect, and how do they inform this wonderful narrative of physicality, intimacy, and emotionality? And then her other question is there some way in which we might read the influence of the early 20th century pre-modernist poet, movie critic, pluralist, universalist, and cross-country rambler Vachel Lindsay into the link or as a bridge between different views of Guthrie?
Oh, great questions. Yeah. Well, I'm really sorry to hear that your family is struggling with Huntington's. As you know, I mean, the really odd and difficult thing about the condition is that it comes on very gradually, and it's very difficult to say when its symptoms are emerging. So like somebody's hand shakes and drops a cup, and when does that start happening enough times that you start to wonder that whether there's something. I mean, if you know Huntington's in your family, like when do you know, or when do you decide that that's actually like a visible symptom of Huntington's? And people can go for a long time. He started to talk about there's a really opaque there are opaque questions around what he knew about Huntington's and what he knew about his mother's illness. So a lot of the assumption had been for a long time that he didn't know that what his mother's died of was Huntington's. I found some evidence that he actually did know much earlier that that's what it had been, but he kind of suppressed it. But he started to say as early as like 1944, 1945, while he was in the Merchant Marine, that he he calls them queer feelings, which I think had to do with like feeling this tingling, feeling this kind of like energy in his limbs and digits that was somewhat out of his control. And then, like I said, it becomes this kind of strange and sometimes kind of vulgar, almost game of trying to guess like when it developed into, so then people are like, oh, well, Sacco and Vanzetti is a bad album, so then he definitely had Huntington's then, but, and he probably, it probably was beginning to impact him more significantly then. But, the playing on that album is fine overall. But if you listen to like, there's a couple of tapes of him playing live in 1950 and 1949 that are available. And it may have to do with drinking, which he uses a form of self-medication, obviously, but he sounds slurred. His voice sounds slurred. He stops and starts a lot of songs. He kind of forgets the words. He has Marjorie on stage with him to remind him of the words, to remind him to stay on track. So, I mean, I think, for a time they were trying to like, and actually at this point it still hadn't been diagnosed, but they knew something was wrong and they were trying to kind of work with it. He stopped being able to play guitar after another fire incident in 53 or 54 when he was visiting his friend Stetson Kennedy in Florida. He tried to start a bonfire, he burned his hand. And that was basically, they couldn't get him to a doctor for hours. And that basically ended his ability to play the instrument. This is also after one of the greatest tragic fire-related incidents of his life was when his 3-year-old daughter died, or I guess she was 4 years old, died in a fire in their house in 1947. Yeah, so there was some definitely like, he was erratic emotionally, and he seems to have like at least once attacked Marjorie physically during this time, in sort of the early 50s. They've split up, although then she became his caretaker again, even though they weren't married. She was, the sort of constant presence in his life when he was in the hospital long-term, and would bring the kids to visit him, et cetera. And then she also preserved all of the materials that are now in the archive. So yeah, you definitely notice changes in his voice by these live concerts, though. And you watch his handwriting decline, and it's so sad because his handwriting had been beautiful, it had been so precise and beautiful, and then first it just gets sort of big, and then it really loses its shape, and it's I mean, that's just as like, it is like watching somebody's body break down, almost directly. Vashel Lindsay, I need to learn more. Do you have any thoughts about that? Do you want to share any thoughts about that, or Kelsey, or can they? I don't know.
Kelsey, if you want to, please do. In the meantime, Alexandra Rahr has a question. She says, I think it was Joe Klein who said the typewriter was the best instrument Woody ever played. Do you think the bodily trauma you referenced earlier, the fires and even the family history of lynching, echo more strongly through his written texts or his musical performances? Does he seem to prefer one form over the other to express trauma?
I think they're everywhere, but I do think that they come out more directly in his written text and his visual art. I think the way that they come out in the songs tends to be kind of indirect, and so I think for instance, the bleakness and the emphasis on like the world as a world of shame in Sacco and Vanzetti, in a project that's allegedly about Sacco and Vanzetti. There's more kind of indirection there, and maybe more metaphor or something there. Whereas even in his, the first time that we learn about all of the fires and death in his childhood and violence is in Born to Bound for Glory. I'm so glad I didn't say Born to Run. Bound for Glory, his autobiographical novel that came out in 1943, which is what he was writing when he met Marjorie, and they would actually like sit up nights talking about it. She was reading it as he was writing it, and I mean that book is really, that book has many different books inside of it actually, and you do see like the boxcar stuff and that kind of romance in it, but there's a lot about his childhood and the kind of some really cruel episodes of bullying in his childhood, and then the bullying of his mother because of what I guess you would later learn were Huntington's symptoms, that she held her body in strange positions, she would knock things over, she was eccentric and hard to talk to, and there's a really poignant passage in the book where he talks about them, and he says he had a special connection to her out of all his siblings, and they would go to the movie theater during the afternoons so that nobody could see them. They would sit in the dark and watch these movies and watch especially Charlie Chaplin movies, which I think is really itself poignant because of the ways that he makes humor out of this kind of like out of control body, or a body that's at the whims of outside forces. And it seems I imagine that with no proof, but like just that as something as sort of a therapeutic exercise. just as I imagine his being drawn to the New York dancing world is something that created a kind of repair for what he'd seen happen to his mother's body, for just the dissolution of his mother's body, to see these young women who are in such complete control of their bodies and can make them do whatever they wanted to do. And even though, they're actually really battered and tired and they have a lot of injuries, they're still so attuned to what they're able to do to their bodies. And that, juxtaposing that with his sort of experience of his mother losing his control of his body is really quite stirring to me. Is there any other dimension of that I passed over?
Well, Kelsey has two clarifications that I could move on. That actually, and the first one kind of ties into what you were just saying. She says, to clarify chronology, I wonder about reading the shifts between different artistic media as liberation rather than as disability, finding new ways to express and create, and despite the changes the disease created in his body and his mind.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think that's great. I think that's a great way to put it. That I thank you for that formulation. Because I do think that there's a kind of ableism that surrounds the way people's stories get told, or famous biographies get written, and I think to really decenter the idea of like a normal body, a normal mind, etc., just opens up so much more understanding of what this work was designed to do, what it was capable of doing. So yeah, I agree. Thank you for that formulation.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me.
Oh, I was just gonna say. Then Kelsey said she could do it to talk about Vachel in an email thread if you were open to that. So,
sure.
I'm sorry, David. Go ahead.
I was just going to add a quick comment about the fragility of Woody's sense of the fragility of bodies. Scholars of disability would say, that being able-bodied is for everybody a temporary condition. And that is something that he seems to be so aware of throughout his whole life in different ways, but he's consistently aware of that from childhood until his death. And I think one of the things that the book does in such rich ways is demonstrate his attunement to that ubiquitous reality that most people don't really come to terms with.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree. I think some of the other things that, like, aspects of the book that we haven't brought up that are interesting in that light. I mean, for instance, the children's music, which is really music that he wrote to, get children to move their bodies in certain ways, and often like very undisciplined ways that would bug the shit out of parents, maybe, I don't know, but like, I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, they're not that crazy, I guess, but like put your finger in the air and leave it about a year. All these kinds of like, sort of like, extreme forms of bodily positioning. And I think there was, and some of this actually was coming from some of the theory that Marjorie had learned in her dance training about, in training healthy bodies and bodies that are capable of dancing, but like trying to teach children's kind of sovereignty over their own bodies, not in a way that's like, oh, you must walk this way, but sort of the opposite, like, you should feel fine about like letting your body do what it wants to do. This is also happening at a kind of turning point in ideas about child rearing that are moving more into kind of like the Dr. Spock, like more liberal era of approach. But yeah, I mean, even that sort of like, there's an ethic of care for the body that he's bringing out through the children's music. And again, it's a sort of care that's about, it's not fixing. It's not like, putting bandages on or whatever. It's about letting the body thrive as itself, as it seeks to thrive itself.
One of the ironies is that he's so successful at conveying this sense of joy and possibility, even while he himself is experiencing this kind of breakdown.
Yeah. And I mean, I do think there's a relationship there. And again, it's one of these things. I mean, here's another thing, here's something, I mean, I can't really prove this. Like, he doesn't write in his notebook, I'm going to write some children's songs because it's so much, it's so beautiful to watch their bodies move when I can't really move my body the same way or whatever. But there's some, I feel like there is some maybe unconscious or semi-conscious, again, just like with watching the dancers earlier on, something in his world, in the way he's feeling the world, the way his body is experiencing the world is drawing him to be fascinated with the life of the body and to be fascinated with how we care for bodies and how we, allow them to become what we ideally want them to become, which can be different for different people, which is another thing that I think he is really quite, actually, I think really quite striking about him is this sort of overall tolerance for interest in difference.
Gus, that was great.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed this.
very much so. Is there any last minute questions from people before we let Gus off the hook? I'm not seeing any hands go up, any virtual hands. So I'll just say thank you so much, Gus, for this intimate hour and a half that we had with you and with Woody Guthrie and with David as well. Thank you both for the conversation. I learned a lot about Woody and about that time that I did not know. I didn't know the connections to the Mattachine Society. I didn't know about so much of what you've talked about today, and not just the facts of it, but the kind of the feeling of his life is a really beautiful way into it. So I'm very, very grateful for both of you for this conversation. Thank you for taking time out to do this. And thank you to everybody who's still in the virtual room for coming out as well.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you.